conversation brought to you by Gatopardo and Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. My name is Mia Armstrong. I work at Arizona State University, and I'm one of the collaborators behind Simbiosis, an innovative alliance between Cronkite and Gatopardo aimed at strengthening narrative journalism in the Americas. Simbiosis includes this series of 8 public conversations, as well as a hands-on workshop in spring 2022, and an on-site residency program for select journalists, which will be held at Gatopardo facilities in the Yucatan Peninsula next summer. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing how to cover social justice and systemic racism, looking at questions including how can individual stories illustrate systemic problems? How should journalists think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and power in the everyday practice of their work? What are the most promising models of community journalism in this space? Today's discussion will be guided by Juan Mandel, Associate Professor and Director of Global Initiatives at the Cronkite School. Juan will be talking with Susan Smith Richardson, the Cronkite School's Ida B. Wells Professor in Journalism. An award-winning senior editor, opinion writer, and manager, Susan's editorial work focuses on race and public policy, storytelling and data, and human rights and international justice. Susan has more than 30 years of experience leading newsrooms known for their unflinching coverage of important social issues. She's served as the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity, a nonprofit investigative newsroom, and editor and publisher of the Chicago Reporter, another nonprofit investigative newsroom that focuses on race, poverty, and income inequality, editorial director at the Solutions Journalism Network, which trains journalists to report about responses to social problems, and as an editorial writer, columnist, and editor at publications including the Chicago Tribune, the Texas Observer, the Sacramento Bee, and the Austin American Statesman. Currently, Susan is a deputy editor at The Guardian US, where she's responsible for driving and defining diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the newsroom and developing coverage on race, identity, power, and inequality. Susan has served twice on Pulitzer Prize panels for editorial and column writing, and at Cronkite, she's teaching classes including media leadership and reporting on social issues. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, Susan. Thank you for being here and giving us your time today. I really look forward to having this conversation. How's everything going for you today?
Oh, everything is just great. I'm excited to have this conversation with you as well. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So let's jump straight into some of these questions that we're going to be discussing today. The first one that I have for you is, when covering social justice issues, and indeed most issues, journalists use experiences of individuals to bring to life systemic problems that they have found through data or other reporting. So how can an individual story illustrate systemic problems, and what should journalists be careful of when trying to do the same thing?
It's such an important question. I think the first thing I want to say before tackling the question directly, Juan, is just this, that we all know that we, on some level, all connect as human beings, right? And issues and policies are more real and meaningful to all of us when we talk about them in terms of the impact that they have on people's lives, even big systems that feel intractable. So I think grounding policy and stories about systems really do start with what they mean in people's lives and how they shape the prospects for people's lives. So it's incredibly important to tell those stories through a very human lens, because that's how it plays out in the real world. But, you know, as you point out, there are some challenges in doing that. The first thing is, if we want to share our humanity and capture how systems affect people, one of the potential downsides of looking at issues through a human lens is when you don't recognize that we are, in fact, humans. Journalists shouldn't go in and try to make the narrative they have fit the person's life, nor should they make the person's life into a data point. As human beings, there's a fundamental respect that's so central to our work that we should always show to people. And we have to be mindful, even when trying to humanize stories, that in the process of that, by turning someone into an example of an issue, that we do not end up dehumanizing the person in that process and reducing them to a data point. That's the downside. Human life is complex. And as we know, while there are aspects to our lives that certainly can easily be shown as illustrative of a systemic problem, we also want to realize each of us, is a complex being with many needs, with many points of view. And we have to be mindful in telling these stories through human experience that we don't marginalize the complexity of human identity.
That's an excellent point. And I think we see this particularly when there's covering of tragic events like hurricanes or earthquakes. And sometimes we see that journalists are trying to fit the interview that they're doing within the narrative that they're trying to tell, even at the cost of not really reflecting the experience of the person that they're interviewing at the time.
Yeah, that's really critical because, we're bringing our own frame to that story. But how people experience, tragedies, natural disasters, it's very individualized. And I think if we go in with saying, yes, I do want to capture that person's experience, but be open to what that experience is. The right impulse is, yes, certainly. We know whenever there's a major event that we do want to go in and we do want to understand what it means to people. But if we go in with a predefined frame or assumption based on our own lived experience about how that person is processing or experiencing the moment, we lose the opportunity to really learn and share with others what it really means to different individuals. One of my, kind of to me, a really classic example of this is, I lived in Chicago for quite a while, and very much a definitive story in that city, sadly, was, the number of people, children in particular, who were either, killed by stray bullets or, failed by some form of violence. Now, on a ground level, what that looks like, one of the immediate things you see happen is people from the community and the family will get the teddy bear, a photo, and they'll place it at the spot where the child was killed. This is a way of bringing together that child's identity, to also say the child mattered. Well, we go as reporters and we see that all the time, but I think what we miss when we see it, because you see it a lot in some places where there's lots of violence, we miss the real point of doing that. That is to say, this was an individual. And if we remember what the balloons, the teddy bears, and the photos of that person say, we'll remember it's trying to capture their individuality. If we take that into all of our encounters, when we're covering, the tragedy, whether it's a shooting or it's, I was just in the middle of a flood and this is how I'm experiencing it. If we remember that point of people saying, this is who this individual was, we can go in with an open mind about our question of how the person experienced that moment and not go in assuming and waiting for them to give me the soundbite that I've already decided I need to tell my story. Reality and how people will respond is much more complex, and kind of going back to that first question you asked about people's lives being illustrative of larger systems. Yes, they can be, they often are, but we can never forget that we're talking about individuals.
And I think your example of Chicago makes a really good example because, as you know, the number of deaths that happen on a weekly basis, either through gun violence or any sort of other fights, I think it also skews the journalist coverage of those tragedies as well, because it's just another number that gets repeated yet again, and it stops putting that emphasis into the loss of a life and into the loss of someone within a community system that plays a really important role within their community and their circles as well.
I really like what you're saying about an individual who plays a role in a community. We often report about communities that are often poor and have higher rates of violence because there is a structural reason for so much of the violence that we see. But we often think of these as communities that have no assets, no people that care, no social fabric, no social network. But these are communities with social networks and social fabric and people who care. What is often failing these communities is systems, governments, policing, and other institutions that aren't working to support the social capital, the social fabric, the human beings trying to work to make these neighborhoods better places to live. It's the systems and institutions that are often failing people. So I think it's so important to note that every community has social fabric, something that's binding it. But I also want to go back. I always think it's important to say this when I talk about Chicago. I lived there for 17 years, so much of the journalist I evolved into is for the really rich learning experience, humbling learning experience of being in such a dynamic city. But I always like to say, it's very easy to stereotype a city. And I know nationally and globally, Chicago has become that city known for its violence. I always want to put in context this really important point. Per capita, there are cities that certainly have, higher murder rates than that city does. It has become, in many ways, in ways that I don't think are always correct, an example of a city that grapples with violence, but certainly it isn't the only city. And I think the other thing always worth mentioning is that when you look at violence and where it occurs, you have to be skeptical too about some official numbers, but you also have to be really, really clear on the connection between violence and disinvestment in communities. Because violence often in cities like Chicago, you find it in very particular neighborhoods where there's been just a long, long history of not investing. And so violence is one manifestation of a lack of investment.
Yeah, absolutely. For the record, I also lived in Chicago and I'm very familiar with the system. And I think journalism was also part of the reason why I was a little bit hesitant at first to move there because of a bad reputation that the city had gained. But when you live there, it's a lot easier for you to get embedded into the community and to understand the complexities of why violence is taking place, why is it always contained within particular zip codes and particular areas, and why those people are so desperate for either the attention of a system or for support from the city that they are not receiving. So
Yes.
I really appreciate you mentioning that and bringing it to attention.
I didn't know we shared Chicago in common either. So that's, yeah.
So let's keep talking about social justice. And the next question for you is, what should solutions journalism on social justice issues look like, and how should it be carried out?
Yeah, I think solutions journalism, let's start with the definition. It's kind of rigorous. Solutions journalism attempts to have kind of a rigorous response to social issues, or an evidence-based approach to looking at how to respond to problems. And it argues that journalism, which has so much been about exposing what's broken and what's wrong, can also take that same tough investigatory lens and put it on investigating responses to what we think are intractable social issues. So just to kind of first start with a better definition of solutions, sometimes I've run into colleagues who say, oh, it's just doing good stories. And I'm like, no, that's not what it is. It's taking that tough-minded analytical lens we use when looking at things that are broken, and then instead using them to look at possible approaches to responding to problems. So it's just as tough-minded. So I always like to begin with a stronger definition. I want to piggyback the beginning of my response on what we were really just talking about. And that is how communities and individuals can turn into these one-dimensional symbols of something, when in fact, reality is always much more complex. So one thing that I think solutions journalism can really be helpful with in looking at social justice issues is first just kind of recognizing complexity. There is no 1, 2, 3 fix to anything, and there is no thing that is broken without complexity either. So solutions brings in somewhat of a complex approach. I think where it's really helpful is that in our society, I think it's quite easy to develop a certain amount of hopelessness when all you see are stories talking about corruption or wrongdoing. What solutions focuses on, and where I think it's helpful with social issues, is it will go to communities and places where there is some evidence over time that a particular response can actually help solve the problem. We can take something really simple like, I'll talk about parking tickets, right? Parking tickets may seem really innocuous, but we know if you don't have any money, and cities use parking tickets as an important source of revenue. If you don't have any money and you end up getting a lot of parking tickets, you end up with a pretty steep bill. Now, in Chicago, there was a whole series of stories about tickets, and they, no surprise, disproportionately violations, whether it was for not having an updated sticker or for parking your car in a certain place, those things add up, and no surprise that they disproportionately impact people who have less income. So one of the solutions projects I actually supported while I was there was to go and look at how the city of San Francisco was dealing with its ticket issues. And so the idea was to go and look at, was there a way to do that that gave people who were facing a harder financial burden more options in terms of how they could pay back those tickets, or whether they needed to pay them back at all. Now, the value of that is to be able to go to a specific place, look at a program that has been in place over time, and see that, yes, there are some ways to address a big problem that's affecting a group of people where you live. You could do the same thing with voting. In places like Australia, where you get the day off to vote, what does that mean in terms of turnout? Would that help drive voter turnout in the United States, where if it gets to 60%, we're all celebrating? So going to places where you could see responses to problems that have been put in place and where there's evidence that they're effective is a good way to build hope, to show that there are ways to move around problems. That's the good part. The downside, of course, is that Australia is not the United States, and that San Francisco is not Chicago, right? So in recognizing that you can go and look at how other models may work, you also have to recognize the limitation, and that is that each city or each country has its own particular history, cultural and otherwise, that may make a certain response easier to do there. As long as you're recognizing the limitations, but acknowledging ideas that have evidence behind them, I think that solutions can be just incredibly powerful. The other thing we always say, and I said this when I worked for solutions journalism, is it's really, really important to acknowledge limitations and also kind of a sense of culture and history, because those things do affect whether or not responses are going to work in your community. But the key word is responses, not solutions to problems. Because, I mean, if we could easily wave a wand and have solutions to problems, would this be a whole better world we'd be living in? It doesn't work that way. But we can look at responses and learn from them and use as much evidence as possible to figure out how they might apply to our community and how to make it a more effective place to live.
That's an excellent response. And while you were talking, I kept coming back to this initiative that happened in Chicago a couple of years ago for the elections, in which they turned the Boost mobile shops into voting locations. And that's where the low-income communities were having most access to be able to go and vote. And that really made a difference, because they understood that rather than trying to push people to the voting centers, it was easier to bring the voting center closer to them and closer to home. And in that case, we saw participations that were in record numbers as compared to previous years. So I really like your approach.
That's such a great example. It's important to have the evidence, as you're pointing out. And these mobile voting booths, are being used in other places. I think they were used in Arizona in the last election, since we're both here talking from the Arizona State University campus.
So let's keep talking about community. What are the most promising models of community-based journalism and how we might implement them?
Well, I was so mindful, Juan, not to make anybody upset by not mentioning their organization. So out of respect for the great local journalism that's happening across the country and the great national journalism as well, I decided I would divide that kind of into two groups. There is the community-based journalism, I think, that very much engages communities and individuals in the direct reporting of information. And then there's this other category, which I just call information as power category. So I'm going to talk about those two and try to steer clear of naming names, because I think these approaches are what are really most important. And I guess if you press me, I may have to name names, so that's on you. So the kind of engaging citizens or engaging residents, directly in journalism. There's a wonderful term that a group in Chicago called City Bureau has used many times, and it's called empowering and equipping. I love that because I think there's a kind of a ethos in journalism around this very thing, to engage people. Empowering means, you're giving people that information that they need to make those decisions about their daily lives. And equipping means by having access to that information, you learn how to, empowering means giving people access to the information, but equipping means you're showing people how to go get the information for themselves. So that becomes not giving someone a fish, but saying, hey, here's the tools so you could go fish. So empowering and equipping, there's a number of organizations that really think about their journalism in that way, and that brings communities into it in a whole different level. Communities are not just, they're engaged in the actual reporting process to serve their specific communities. And I guess I may have to come back and give a better example, but empowering and equipping, bringing folks and giving them tools to do some level of reporting on their own, and then sharing that back with their communities. I think that's an important way of seeing journalism, and it makes journalism, I guess I'll call it, much more democratic, but I also think it makes it more authentic and useful. Then there's kind of a second group, and I just call this information as power. And that's the idea that you look at information in the same way as a community organizer would look at information. As someone who used to do community organizing, I appreciate this. And this is the basic idea. In order to act, which is, I think, a function of journalism, in order for people to act, they first have to have information. And so a community organizer model says information is a form of power. I gotta get information. I have to connect people with that information. And based on this information, people will decide how to act. But there's a way to take that and even go deeper. What if journalism were more about, let's figure out through organizers what issues most matter to communities. And then we get organizers whose real function is to go out and determine, in a community organizer model, what information people find most critical, and then let's report it back to them and share it with them. So that, to me, is a community organizer type of model, which I think is incredibly valuable, because it says, let's determine what communities say they want and need to know about, and let's make sure that our reporting is in response to their needs. So information is power in a way that I think a community organizer would look at information. That I see as kind of one kind of group, and the other one going back to the idea of empowering and equipping. The other approach is give people the tools to go out and do the reporting directly themselves through agencies, commissions, and institutions that directly affect their lives. I think these two approaches are really, really important because they begin to break down walls between journalists and communities that I think at times, maybe we didn't have some of this disconnect, but I think today it's incredibly important to rethink the core function of journalism. And if you want to just get really, really elemental about it, I think the role of journalism in and out of season is essentially this. It gives people the information they need to self-govern or to make decisions in their daily lives. It's really essentially what it does. I think these two approaches we talked about that are more community-based recognize that people could be engaged in the process of actually identifying that information and using it, or we can go directly to audiences and figure out, as a community organizer would, what information they most need to make their lives better, according to their definition of better. So I hope I didn't kind of skate that by not naming names of organizations. I think it's more important to talk about the approaches to how to bring people into the information gathering process.
I think that was an excellent answer. We covered relevance, attention, and cognition, which are very important topics when it comes to media processing. So in order for journalists to be able to serve the population better, they also need to find topics that the population itself considers relevant and something urgent. And in addition, we know that audiences have a limited capacity for processing information. So by choosing the right topics, we have a stronger opportunity for actually resonating with them and them acting on information that they got. So I think that your answer was very eloquent and went to the point. So now let's shift a little bit more to talk about some of the pressing issues that we have with the US society as a whole. And one of the pressing topics that we need to address as communicators today is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So a question for you is, how should journalists be thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the everyday practice of their work?
That's really important, and as you know, always important, but especially now as the demographics of the United States change, and we saw in the last census, or the information we have from the most current census, a decline in the percentage of Americans who consider themselves the category of white. And we know that those numbers will only continue to evolve as the communities of color continue to grow in the US. So it's a huge shift in who news organizations need to think of in terms of who they're serving. So before I answer that directly, there are terms that I prefer to use. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, I know, is the term we use, and we say DEI for short. I think really the essence of it for me is equity, which is kind of what people have been looking for in information. Power, which means that you're not just at the table, but that you have the ability to affect a change. And belonging in the newsroom. I want to feel like it is a space where I'm valued and I belong. So for me, looking at groups like the Maynard Institute, ONA, and Open News, who are kind of rethinking the language, those are words that they use: power, belonging, welcoming, equity, and I think they're very real terms. Diversity means that we may have everybody showing up, but the fundamental issue really is about equity in a sense of belonging and having power in decisions over the news that we decide to cover, or how we even define news. So just words that I like to think a lot about. But why does this matter? To your point, And how should it be baked into the everyday? I think about being inclusive in coverage just as I would about accuracy. I think DEI, if you want to use that term, and diversity in journalism is a question of accuracy. If we would not allow someone to spell somebody's name incorrectly, why would we allow someone not to understand the context, the historic context that may shape policing in the United States, or a court decision, or why there continues to be housing and educational segregation in the United States? Understanding that, to me, is fundamental if you're going to cover anything about the United States. And that's a question of both accuracy and proficiency. We have to be proficient in understanding some core structural issues that drive what this country is. And if we cannot get that, we cannot adequately, authoritatively, contextually, and most important, accurately, again, cover this country. So it should be baked into everything we do. The example I always like to give is this one. But I think this is for all journalists, not just specialists. I would be a very bad healthcare reporter if you interviewed me and I said, AIDS, what is AIDS? Polio, what's that? You wouldn't hire me. We have a standard for a base level of knowledge that you have to have for a specialty beat. I think, and we have a base level in terms of performance just to be a general journalism practitioner. I think a basic proficiency around race, its history in the United States, and the complex political construct and social construct that it is, has to be a basic level of literacy now for all journalists. So where does it fit in? To me, it fits right in with accuracy and giving someone a bad grade if you have to make corrections all the time.
Great, that's an excellent response. And because we're running short on time, I'm going to combine the last two questions that I had for you into a broader topic that I think it's worth discussing. So I've seen in many cases when a journalist goes and tries to cover a particular minority, and perhaps inadvertently, it kind of becomes a little bit of a tokenization of the minority as someone that stands out from mainstream society. So I guess the question for you is, how can we make sure that we're covering these diverse populations or these minority populations without tokenizing? But also, how can we steer away the population from stereotypes that they might develop based on previously created ideas that they got about a particular group of people from the media?
Yeah, no, just ongoing homework for us on that one, right? I think you're so right, Quando, saying that for many of us, if we haven't had exposure to people who are different from us, which is a whole lot of people, then no, our understanding or what we think is our understanding of them does come through media, whether it's a television show, music, or the article I read in the newspaper, or the story I heard on NPR or whatever. So I think first we have to recognize, just to center this conversation, that we have a tremendous amount of social responsibility for how people see each other. And that is why we also have to be mindful about capturing the complexity of diverse people, to show that they are not just crime victims, they're also CEOs, they're also former presidents, they're whatever. So we have to be mindful that we are, for many people, the place where they're seeing someone who is not like them. And we have to be mindful about being accurate in our representation of people in communities over time. And that's just being intentional. But to get back to this question of how do we as journalists cover people who are different from us without tokenizing them, I want to kind of go back to what we just said a minute ago and at the beginning of this conversation. First, we just recognize humanity. Oftentimes I'm surprised when someone will ask a question of me about other Black people. And it's like, well, why would Black people be any different than you who is white? We're humans too. So I always remind people, that's a question you're asking to other people, but do you really understand what it means to ask me this? Because isn't that part of the human condition that we all have these common things? So just stop yourself before asking certain questions and ask, isn't this just a people thing and not a race thing? But to get more complex, I think the way that we don't tokenize people is through these things. We have to insist on having racially and geographically diverse newsrooms. That means we're in conversation with people who come from different lived experiences at all times. And that helps us rethink some of our assumptions. Two, I think that we need to read history about people who are different from us, understand the historical context and the differences. I read stories about, I was just telling students this the other day, I read stories about gender or books about gender non-conforming people because that's not my experience and I want to understand that. I ask the same thing of my fellow journalists to read and understand the history and text of communities that are not your communities, because that's our responsibility as well. I think it's also important to cover people, if we just want to talk specifically about race, don't just use sources who are Black or brown or Asian when you're writing about that topic. Use those sources all in various ways, because that is how, for lack of a better word, you normalize their experience. Yes, they're part of a specific racial group, but they also have contributions across the board. And the last point I want to make, and I think it's important for reporters who are asked in some way to cover issues of race, do not go to communities when there is a crisis or you're on deadline. Go just to go and understand and get a sense of how life plays out in communities. When you go in on deadline or for a story, you're going in a very extractive way. Be present and be there, and don't be on deadline. Be there to see what life is like. So being mindful that you create a diverse newsroom, so you're hearing different perspectives all of the time. Take it upon yourself to read and learn about cultures that aren't yours. I do that constantly, and make sure that when you are talking about sources that come from communities of color, you're not just bringing them in to talk about issues of race, but bringing them in on a range of issues as valued sources.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's as much time as we have today, Susan. I wish we could continue talking, but I hope that this conversation is going to lead into more opportunities for us to continue working together in seeing how we can improve our coverage and what we can do to make things better. But thank you so much for your time, Susan. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you very soon.
Thank you. Have a wonderful time. Thanks so much, Juan, for the wonderful questions.
You too. Goodbye, Susan.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation. Remember that this is part of a series of 8 public chats, which you can find right here, exactly where you found this one, on Wednesday evenings through December 1st. These public conversations are part of Simbiosis, a narrative journalism training program brought to you by ASU's Cronkite School and Gatopardo. The program also includes a hands-on workshop held in the spring and on-site residencies in the Yucatan Peninsula held next summer. You can stay up to date on all the activities on our website or by subscribing to our mailing list, both found at the links below. Until next time, thank you, gracias, cuídense.